everyone. I'm Hannah Leventova. I'm an MBA student here, class of 2021, and I'm also the president of the Government and Business Club, which I encourage everyone to join before the end of this Friday. It's my honor to introduce today's esteemed panel of guests. Our first panelist is Senator Emanuel Jones. He is currently serving in his 8th term representing Georgia's 10th district in the Georgia State Senate. His impressive record of public service is far too long to list in our allotted time, but a few highlights. He served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, where he rose from second lieutenant to the rank of captain. He currently sits on several key Senate committees in Georgia, including Appropriations and the Banking and Financial Institutions Committee. And he's a member and former chairman of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. He's also vice chair of the Georgia Senate's Democratic Caucus and is chairman of the Martin Luther King Jr. Advisory Council, which he created through legislation 8 years ago to organize Georgia's annual celebration of Dr. King. Senator Jones is also an entrepreneur and an automobile dealer and inventor. He is president and founder of the Legacy Automotive Group, which owns the Legacy Ford dealership in the Atlanta area. He has won numerous business awards and was nominated by Ambassador Andrew Young for the 2008 John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. Senator Jones earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, and he earned his MBA from none other than Columbia Business School. Our second panelist is Amanda Litman. She is the co-founder and executive director of Run for Something, a political action committee that helps young progressives run for local office. Since launching in 2017, Run for Something has elected more than 300 people across the country. Previously, Ms. Litman led digital fundraising and email operations for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential run and for Charlie Crist's 2014 campaign for Florida governor. She also worked as an email writer for Barack Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. She's also the author of Run for Something, a Real Talk Guide to Fixing the System Yourself, published by Simon & Schuster in 2017. And last but not least, our moderator is Gwen Shufro. She is a director of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise. She's also a district leader and vice chair of the town of Mamaronec's Democratic Committee. Mamaroneck. Oh goodness, Mamaronec's Democratic Committee. She's also one of the original founders of the Government and Business Club here at CBS, from which she graduated in 2006.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And just to let you all know that we'll be having a moderated discussion at first, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A feature of the webinar. So thank you again to our speakers who are here today to talk not only about sort of the national scene in politics, but also to talk a little bit more about local politics, state and city politics, and why and how you can all get involved. So I thought to kick it off, we could just ask both our panelists how you first got started in politics and how you are still involved today. And we could start with Amanda.
Thank you, Gwen, for having me. This is really fun. So as you said, my name is Amanda Litman. I'm one of the co-founders and executive director of Run for Something. I was born and raised in Virginia, right outside DC, so I grew up in the suburbs. I always loved politics. I thought it was a fascinating, complicated, messy, compelling way to directly make the world a better place. And I was a little bit of a hippie in that sense. I thought that was my mission in life. I knocked doors for Virginia candidates growing up. I went to Northwestern for college specifically because I wanted to work for Barack Obama. When I was a junior in high school, I skipped a day of class to go see him speak when he was running for president the first time. It was before he launched his campaign. He was doing like a tour of students for Obama rallies to sort of test around his speech. And I was hooked. I was like, I want to do whatever I can to one day work for that man. So when I was looking at colleges my senior year of high school, I had a family friend who was interning on the Obama campaign in Chicago. I said, I want to do what Jess is doing. I want to work for Obama too. So it's one of the reasons I chose Northwestern to go to school. I studied American Studies. I focused on women in politics. So I wrote my thesis on women running for office against other women and how it changed gender performance in TV ads. I was an intern for local county Democratic Committee. I worked on the Hill for a summer. For a brief minute, thought I wanted to work in political journalism, so I worked at various magazines and media outlets. But by the time my senior year came around, I got an internship on the Obama campaign in downtown Chicago. And at this point was the re-elect. I was hired before I graduated as a full-time staffer to work on the email fundraising team. So if you ever got an email from Barack Obama that said, hey, in the subject line, or like dinner, that was me and my team. And it has been a nonstop ride of campaigns and now Run for Something ever since.
Wow, that sounds very exciting. And Senator Jones, how did you get started in politics?
Well, thank you, Gwen, and thank you to the CBS family for this event. My start in politics was a little bit different. Back in the University of Pennsylvania, I remember my senior year, and I decided to run for student class representative to the senior class board. And surprisingly, I won. So one can say that kind of put the seed in me of running for office. But when I finished my graduate studies at Columbia, I had to go out and get a job and find a career, as we all have to make those decisions during that time. And I found myself in the car business a few short years after graduating from Columbia. And I started this business 28 years ago. That was a bankrupt dealership that I reopened in a little old city in my hometown of the great state of Georgia called McDonough. And it's really from that experience in McDonough and having served on just about every community board and every volunteer board in this area. I was the first African-American to chair the Chamber of Commerce. I had a chance to interact with all the business community. I served on the board at our local community hospital, Piedmont Henry Medical Center. I chaired the finance committee. And you name the event, from United Way campaigns to Rotary clubs to my church affiliation and serving on the deacon board, and it goes on and on and on from there. But really, out of that community service and my company's ability in serving this community, and which kind of raised my profile, by the way, and I may also add it raised my bank account as well, led to my candidacy, where I was encouraged to run some 16, 17 years ago for the state Senate. That was an open seat, even though I had no prior experience in elected office. And Amanda, thank you. I believe everybody should run for something. And it's from that experience, that very first campaign that I ran, and I won, by the way, and I've been in the state Senate ever since.
That's exciting to hear how you made it happen for yourself, coming from the business world to join a kind of local politics. Amanda, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to found Run for Something? It sounds so exciting to work for Barack Obama's campaign, but why did you focus on sort of local and state politics and maybe making it easier for young candidates to get more involved?
So I worked for Hillary for 2 years. It was the hardest, best, most painful, privileged, terrible thing I've ever done. It was all of those things and then some. The week after Election Day, I got a Facebook message from somebody I went to college with. Hey, Amanda, you've been posting about politics for years. You seem to have worked in this space for a while. If I want to run for office, I'm a public school teacher in Chicago. They keep cutting our budgets. What do I do? If Trump can be president, it seems like anybody can do this. What do I do? And I did not have an answer for him, because at the time, if you were young, 20s or 30s, newly excited about politics and wanted to do more than vote and more than volunteer, there was nowhere you could go that would help you. And the more that I thought about that, the more that I realized that was a symptom of larger problems in the Democratic Party. And this was something that we could fix by creating a place for young people to go if they wanted to run for office. So I emailed a bunch of people, one of whom became my co-founder, this guy named Ross Morales-Riquetto, who has worked in campaigns for about 15 years. We wrote a plan, we built a website, and then we launched Run for Something on Inauguration Day. We thought it would be really small. Like, nobody really wants to run for office. This is really hard. We'll get 100 people in the first year. Cool side project. 1,000 people signed up in the first week. And as of today, we're up to more than 62,000 people all across the country who've said, I want to run for office. Now what? And we specifically focus on young people under the age of 40 running for local office for the first time. So for us, local means state house, state senate, school board, library board, city council, university boards of regents, judges, sheriffs, DAs, the positions in which most people don't think about as important, but as it turns out, are literally life or death offices. They make the decisions that directly affect our quality of life and whether we're able to make it to the next day. So as we think about how can we make the biggest difference for the most amount of people, can we get better people into these local offices?
Right. And so in terms of local politics and it being so important in terms of every day, how government affects your life and legislation nationwide eventually, Senator Jones, can you give us an example of how local politics have been very impactful, or a bill or piece of legislation that you've pushed along at the state level in Georgia that's made a real difference?
Oh, absolutely. Local politics are critical, particularly to anyone that's in business and really all facets of life. One of the things that I had to do early on in my business is go and secure business licenses. And just to walk through that maze and be able to start a business is challenging. But you have to deal with the local officials. And it was in that process that you learn about how government sometimes operate efficiently and also how government sometimes operates inefficiently. But when you look at the impact you have and the footprint that you have to make in starting a business, you are dealing with all local elected officials. Not only that, but anyone who has any kind of a business in any community, you are then governed by those local laws. My business I acquired some 28 years ago was in the unincorporated part of, quote, Henry County. The city of McDonough some 10 or 15 years ago decided they wanted to expand and annex the property, and they did. So they annexed my business into the city of McDonough, which is still in Henry County. And those kind of decisions that are made by locally elected officials will always have a profound effect on your business. It would always have a profound effect on the community. And of course, I have 3 kids, and all of my kids had to go through the school system as well. And we're all concerned about the school system and what our representative officials and the decisions they're making that impact the curriculum in those schools, and not just at the local level, but also at the state level as well. So all during those facets, government is involved in our daily lives in one way or the other, particularly at the local level.
Right. Amanda, anything you'd like to add about local politics and the importance?
I think it's also worth thinking about the ways in which structures are set up. By that I mean, if you care about who's representing you in Congress, you have to care about who draws the maps, which in most states is state legislatures. You have to care about who passes the rules about who can vote, which in most places is state legislatures. If you care about Roe v. Wade, for example, coming up before the Supreme Court, the laws that will get challenged on that front will come from state legislatures. The things that we think about as solely federal problems have their roots locally. And it is something that others have really invested a lot of time and effort into, and that, at least as a Democratic Party, we've failed to historically, which leaves us running behind on a playing field that wasn't made for us.
Right, and I think we can see every day now during the pandemic how local government is impacting our lives on a day-to-day basis, from our kids potentially going to school in person to where we can vote and when we can vote. And that does lead me to, how has the pandemic changed efforts to run for office right now, to get out the vote? I heard on your podcast, Amanda, you talked to State Senator Erin Zweiner in Texas, and she talked about bringing her baby along to canvass and talk to real-time voters. And it really impacted, she thinks, getting out the vote and talking to people who could then register and vote. And I just wonder, do you lose that element of connecting at a human level with voters, and how are you dealing with that?
Canvassing is the lifeblood of a campaign, especially for a local campaign, so state house or state Senate or lower down the ballot. Canvassing is how you win. You out-hustle your opponent by knocking more doors and having more relationships with voters. During the pandemic, we have come at it with the approach that it is, for most people, too dangerous to canvass. Not the least of which is that you don't want to put yourself at risk by exposing yourself to a whole bunch of people. But you don't know whether the doors you're knocking are someone who is quarantined or immunocompromised or a senior citizen, especially when the communities that we canvass tend to predominantly be communities of color or lower income, because those are the folks you can't reach in other ways. Those are people who are already at higher risk for COVID. So we have come at it as an organization in that unless you're the Biden campaign with billions of dollars to spend covering everyone with PPE and running testing and like really, candidates should not be canvassing. There's a very rare scenario where that might not be the case, but generally speaking, candidates should not be canvassing. So how do you recreate that same experience of going at someone's home and having a conversation with them in the platforms that are safe and low risk? Because it's not actually the literal like knock on someone's door that makes that a compelling tool for campaigns. It's the conversation between candidate and voter. It's the two-way feedback. It's the personal relationship. It's the accountability that the voter then has to the person they've met and they have feel like they know. As it turns out, there's a lot of different ways, especially now that technology has advanced so much, that you can recreate that in other platforms. So week 2, maybe of the pandemic, so end of March, we rolled out resources for campaigns.com. It's a regularly updating hub with information for how campaigns can navigate this new environment. Town halls on Facebook, Zooms like this, WhatsApp groups and Slacks, and Facebook Lives, Instagram Lives, and a lot of text messaging, and honestly, a lot of phone calling. People are home for the most part, not all, but many people are home. They're answering their phones and they want to talk to someone who can do something about their problems. The other thing that we have found for a lot of our candidates is they end up doing what I would call community service work more than campaign work. So that's delivering food at food banks, running errands for their community members, facilitating unemployment insurance problems. Really making sure that people can navigate the bureaucracy of government in a way that is meaningful and being there for their voters, knowing that their voters will remember it and show up for them when it matters most.
Senator Jones, you also mentioned sort of community involvement, just like Amanda spoke about, getting involved in the networks in your community as you think about getting more involved in community activism and potentially running for office. You know, what advice do you give to business school students or alumni who might be in the private sector but want to get more involved? Is a first step getting involved first in those community organizations, and sort of how you did in Georgia, or what else do you suggest?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is to simply do it. And let me just tell you what I mean by that. A lot of us, particularly in the business community, think about how we can be impactful in our communities. And there's so many different things we can do, from the products that we sell to certainly the vendors that we interact with, as well as the community that we built up around our businesses. But when you have that kind of interaction with, particularly with your customers and vendors, you tend to recognize some of the concerns and issues that they may have. And for me, particularly being in retail, I have an opportunity to dialogue firsthand with my customers. And you understand their plight, you hear the concerns in the community, and you hear about the experiences their children have had in the school system as well, and just some of the other issues they've had to deal with. Last we talk about the criminal justice system. And when I say just do it, you can either sit idly by and continue to focus on your business, or you can sit and say, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to do something about some of the issues that some of my customers are dealing with, and not just my customers, but also my family members as well, and get involved. And that decision was an easy decision for me. I know 16, 17 years ago when I made a decision to run for office, I looked around, and Amanda can attest to this, you got to have a base, some kind of base. This state Senate seat in Georgia, there's 56 of us and represent about 200,000 individuals. And I looked around and said, where is my base? Who will support me if I make this decision? So naturally, you want to look at those that you've interacted with on a daily basis. And for me, that was a lot of my customers, a lot of my church members who are also my customers, certainly my family members as well. And you start thinking about, now that I have a base, how can I expand that base? And for anyone that's considering getting involved in politics, you got to focus on expanding your base, regardless of what level of politics you're getting involved with. And for me, I knew I had to go out and capture a wider audience, and you have to take advantage of every media asset there is out there. And over the years, in the 16 years that I've been in politics, I've seen those assets change from, particularly in my business, where I used to do a lot of television advertising. I had a commercial I would do practically every single month and keep it on air for about 2 weeks. And now that market has shifted to more of a social media campaign, and you have to adapt. And for me to have been around and survived in this legislature as long as I have, adapting was part of it. And those are the kind of things you learn in business school. I look back, my days of being at Columbia and being in the social gatherings and the meetings and interacting with your professors, you always got to adapt. And the courses I took in finance and the courses I took in accounting was instrumental in me starting my business, not only starting the business, but it's also instrumental in me being able to survive the economic recessions and, of course, depressions that we had over the years. And more importantly, just interacting with my fellow classmates, those conversations that we've had, those contacts that we made, those relationships that you build. And that's a lot of what politics is about. That's a lot of what being in business is about, those personal and interpersonal relationships that you build. And for me and for my life, there was no better place to start than at Columbia University.
All right, that's very interesting and helpful to the business school students out there. Amanda, what kind of resources or support do you give to young candidates who sign up with Run for Something? I know that fundraising is always a worry. And do you have any, MBA or business school type students on your staff or helping out to volunteer as well?
Yes. So if you sign up on our website, you will then join a conference call where we walk through the basics on how to campaign. You'll then have a one-on-one with one of our volunteers. And so anyone on this call can be a candidate, but also anyone on this call can be a volunteer. You don't need any special skill set to help screen candidates. We give you a script, we tell you what we're looking for, but it's really for us to really learn more about potential candidates and for us to understand what their needs are. From there, candidates have access to a whole bunch of things. We work with basically every group you can imagine to make sure that our candidates, the people in our pipeline, know about the resources available to them that other organizations might be offering. We co-sponsor stuff, we write programs together. We have some resources ourselves. So on our website, as I mentioned, but also through our email program, guides on how to file to get on the ballot in every state, guides on how to do public speaking, how to run Facebook ads, how to do YouTube lives. Basically any question you might possibly have, we have written materials that you can access on your time to help walk you through it. We do community building, so we connect candidates to each other, making sure that what we have heard from people, and we did a survey on this after 2018, was that 60% of candidates identified a relationship with another candidate as their greatest source of resiliency. Because running for office is really hard and it's lonely and you can't complain to your partner, you can't complain to your family, you can't complain to your volunteers or to your staff. So being able to commiserate to someone with who's going through something similar, much like I imagine business school is like, where it's terrible, but you have your classmates to go through it with you, is really powerful. And then we do endorsements, and endorsements is an additional application process. It's a written, we want to know your plan, your WIN number, how you're going to get from A to Z. We endorse about 50% of the people who applied, maybe a little less. We have now endorsed more than 1,500 people in our 3 years, predominantly women, predominantly Black, Indigenous people of color, about 25% LGBTQ. Their ranges age 18 to 40 in all 50 states at all levels of local office. So from tiny municipal offices with 300 voters to state legislative races with more than 1 million. And they're phenomenal. Many of them have MBAs or are small business owners or large business owners. Many others do not. What we have found is that the thing that makes our candidates collectively similar is a strong rationale for running. They're able to articulate the problem they want to solve and then an office that would let them solve it. And if you can clearly articulate your why, because it's the question you're going to get asked 1 million times a day, why are you running? If you can clearly articulate that, everything else in your campaign becomes much easier. Because it's no longer a question of what are you believing or what do you believe? It becomes a question of how do you communicate what you believe? And that is one that is much easier and much more straightforward to solve.
Right. And in the spirit of sort of this webinar series and a class we have here at Columbia Business School called Bridging the American Divides, I'd be curious to hear what you think about sort of the political divides at the local level versus the national level. Is it possible to, have bills that both sides can agree on? I know we're talking more and more about social justice these days. Can we bridge that partisan divide at all? What do you see at the state and local level, if at all possible? Maybe Senator Jones.
Well, the answer to your question is yes, and we do it regularly in the General Assembly in Georgia, by the way. Unfortunately, the bills that make all of the attention, particularly the national attention, are the ones that everyone's fighting. The religious freedom bill or the fetal abortion bills, those are the kind of legislation that make national attention. But if you set those kind of social, what I call injustice bills aside, most of the other legislation we pass in the General Assembly are passed 90% where both parties support. You got to understand who you are and who your party is and who you represent, who our constituents are. So when those, quote, social injustice bills come up, we have to be prepared to take a position on it. The community depends on us taking a position on it. Our constituents depend on us taking a position on it. And those that sent us to the General Assembly depend on us taking a position on it. Georgia, just like the rest of the country, I know when I first got in the legislature some 16 years ago, out of the 56 senators, only 14 of us were Democrats. Today, our numbers, we've gone over the past 15, 16 years from 14 to 21, and we're projected to we will pick up at least another 4 seats this year. So in Georgia, you can see the numbers are almost reaching parity, but this isn't anything that's new. This is something that demographers could, and they foresaw well over a decade ago. And I remember at our biennial, these are something that we talked about. What are the trend lines? And of course, and everyone knows what the trend lines are, not just in states like Georgia down south, but you can see the trend lines nationally, which is why this country is going to be majority minority in another 20 to 30 years. Those kids are already out there, and things are already happening in not just in this country, but also you can see the same kind of trend lines in the state of Georgia. And we have to be aware of that. We have to adjust our positions. And we've always said as Democrats that we have a really big tent. But when I look at the national level, I don't see that same, quote, big tent out there on the other side. I am a surrogate for Joe Biden in the great state of Georgia, and I am honored to represent the positions of our party everywhere we go and speak, even though our speaking is done virtually. But the message that we have to get to Georgians and the rest of the country is that we have to be inclusive and that we have to embrace the diversity in this country. And we've certainly gotten that message across in our great state of Georgia. I am more excited, and I've seen people in my community more excited about voting this time around than I have in any other previous election, of course, except when perhaps President Obama. But I would venture to say that we are more excited because we recognize that the threat to people's personal freedom, the threat that we see coming out of Washington is so different than what we've seen before, particularly for people of color. And my district is about 80% minority, by the way, and I try and represent the interests of my constituents, and not just my constituents, but you got to look at all of Georgians, by the way. And I think all of us should be concerned about the rhetoric that we hear and some of the things that we've seen over the years coming out of DC these last 4 years. It, to me, seems as if I've been in a time warp, and I'm trying to wake up one day and realize that these last 4 years never, ever happened. We have that opportunity to wake up on November the 3rd, and I know in the great state of Georgia, we are well on our way to doing that.
And Amanda, at the local level too, when you run for something like school board, there's not necessarily a party attached to your candidacy. So is that an opportunity perhaps to kind of bridge some of those divides? Local issues can maybe not fall as evenly along party lines. What do you see there?
I think that's exactly right. Especially the more local you get, the less it's partisan, the more it's pragmatic. Trash pickup. Trash is an equity issue. In New York, we just did a panel with a bunch of New York candidates, and they were talking about the trash pickup in the Bronx versus trash pickup in Times Square. Trash is an equity issue, and a social justice issue, which I cannot stop thinking about. But generally speaking, this is not a partisan divide. It is a certain amount of pragmatic in the way that you pay for things, but it's not about party. Clean water, for the most part, in some states it unfortunately is, but Clean water is not a partisan issue for the most part. Parks, schools, some of these things have become partisan in nature, but it's more complicated than Democrat versus Republican. And I think that is where you get into the personal nature of politics. I also think there is a certain amount of reality that people have more trust in their local elected officials than they do in federal government. I was reading some surveys this morning about, especially around like election administration, like 30-something% of people trust the federal government to capably administer the election, but as opposed to their local, the numbers are in the low 60s. States, at the state level, it's like 50%, which is still not great, but the more local you get, the more confidence you have that the people who will represent you will do their jobs competently. I think a big part of that is because you have a personal relationship with them. This is not a member of Congress or a senator who's flying off to DC every week. It's someone that you're going to see from a safe distance, socially distant, with a mask on in the grocery store. Or maybe they go to your gym, or maybe they, you used to play basketball with them every weekend. It's a personal relationship with your local elected official that is, I think, very different and creates a certain higher level of accountability than necessarily with congressional candidates or higher.
Right. Thank you. Just looking at some of the questions in Q&A, someone asked, how can we run for something when career politicians hold seats for years? And in New York, we've seen some changeover in the congressional seats in New York City, but even becoming part of your Democrat or Republican town committee in a place like New York City is extremely difficult to do because there's sort of an entrenched political machine, as we seems to be. Can you talk a little bit just how to get more involved in the machine or break through the machine and just really get involved and influence kind of your city committees or elected officials a bit more?
Well,
yeah.
I think
Go ahead, sir.
I think the way to get involved is like I did at the local level, where you start participating in different associations. Anything that you can do to get your name in the community, anything that you can do to build a base. Either you get involved in a church and you contribute your time and your resources, and as we say in my church, your talents as well, and treasure, to building that institution. There's so many ways to get involved at the local level, and anyone that will take the time and the effort to get involved at the local level. It could be your HOA, your homeowners association, whatever kind of position you are, there's always an association out there that you can participate in. There's always a group that you can join. There's always a place where you can go and volunteer your time. And I've seen a whole lot of incumbents get beat, by the way, entrenched incumbents get beat. And I don't want to give anyone the impression that an incumbent is entitled to a position. I certainly don't feel like I am, because I had a primary opponent just this past June and that I had to dispose of in my election. And I did well in that primary, over 80% of the vote, because I'm well known in the community and everyone knows that I don't ever take their vote for granted. Too many incumbents do. But out of your base, if you can build a base, then that base become those who's going to knock on doors for you. That base become those who's going to hang yard signs for you. That base become those that are going to go out and create social media platforms and work on your behalf. So from whatever you are and wherever you are in your life, I would focus on building a base, and from that base, then you can grow your campaign. And that's how incumbents are beat, because they take for granted those interpersonal relationships, because they may have been in the state Senate too long. They may have been in Congress too long, or they may have been in a school board seat too long. And Amanda mentioned something that's critically important, by the way, and Gwen, I think you touched on it well, about the influence of politics, particularly party politics at the local level. I would suggest to you that even at the local level, in today's environment, those relationships have gotten strained as well. Typically, you wouldn't think so, but you got to understand, when you have a bully pulpit and a big microphone coming out of a national and talking to a national audience, all of those things kind of filter down to the local level. So we've seen a lot of that here in the past decade, about how local politics has shifted to more party politics as well. And some of these seats may be nonpartisan, but we always know who the Democratic candidate is in that nonpartisan race, and we will always know who the Republican candidate is, or the independent in that nonpartisan race. So we have to stay focused if you want to get started, start somewhere. And for me, it was my business. That became my base. That became my platform. That became my springboard to getting more involved in the community. That became my springboard to, out of 7 candidates, the first time I ran for office, never having tried before, I was able to dispatch and dispose of them and win that seat and hold on to that seat like I've done these last 16 years.
Amanda, do you have anything to add, also considering that many of the students at Columbia maybe are coming from other cities and states? How do they get more involved in sort of the local political scene here?
Well, especially here in New York, I'm in Brooklyn, coming to you from Carroll Gardens. There's actually a lot of ways you can get involved locally, especially even if you're not a homeowner. Like, this is a rental. Like 60% of New Yorkers are not homeowners. Community boards, I think, are really interesting and compelling. And Peak, New York, if you've never been to a community board meeting, so every neighborhood has a community board. There are 52 of them, I believe. Excuse me. It is like the wildest, almost stereotypical New York City politics you could imagine. I went to a community board meeting in the spring last year in which there was people screaming at each other and yelling, calling each other horrific names over bike lanes and parking spots and liquor licenses. It was so fun. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And all of these meetings are now virtual, which actually makes it even easier, and that you can attend them by Zoom or by YouTube or Facebook, depending on the platform they're using, and really get to pay attention and ask questions. And if you care, especially right now, about the small businesses in your neighborhood, go to community board meetings. They make recommendations to city council members. For the most part, they are obliged or are taken into consideration. You can also, you'd be surprised how approachable your city council member is. About 2/3 of them are out of a seat next year. So there'll be open elections. This is a big deal in New York. They are expecting more than 500 candidates or so to run for city council across the city. These races are hugely important, but small in scope. Most of these campaigns will not spend more than $200,000 or $300,000, depending on what the public financing limits are next year. They will be trying to reach every last voter. In my neighborhood, for example, the winner in 2013 got 5,000 votes. Fourth runner-up got 4,000 votes. Now, these are big districts. They're bigger than a lot of congressional districts, but they are small, pretty low turnout. And especially as you're looking ahead to New York City elections next year, ranked choice voting. This will be the first year we have ranked choice voting in New York, which is a little wrinkle. If you're not familiar, it's where you go to the ballot and you stack rank your candidates. You rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they calculate all the votes, and the lowest people who all ranked 4 get taken away. And then if I ranked person number 4 or person number 1 who gets taken away, they move to my second choice. That was an inartful way of describing it. But basically, the winner has to be like the collective voter population's first, second, or third choice. It is going to make it really messy. It's also going to make it really fun. And if you're interested in getting involved in city politics, whether as a candidate or a staffer, getting involved in a city council race next year is the absolute best way to do it. And the senator noted this. You need to build a base. Your relationships with other people, especially people who are part of the political process in a deep and engaged way, will be your most important currency in your campaign. Because then you're going to know who to call when you decide to run for office and need the help. So starting to get to know those folks, whether virtually or in a safe and socially distanced way in the city, will make a big difference. If you're planning on moving somewhere else when you graduate, or you can still participate in local politics from afar. I think it's one of the few silver linings of the pandemic is that you can attend city hall meetings over Zoom. It may be harder to find the information, but it is absolutely something you can seek out if you go to the city council website for whatever place you're looking to move and get involved. There is no downside. And I often find it to be riveting. If you're looking for time, sitting on a city council meeting is buck wild. And
go ahead.
the only thing I say is you're probably going to be one of only a few people there. So your voice, if you have an opinion, will matter a lot. You will be a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah, it reminds me of my favorite show, Parks and Rec. You know, the people that show up for the meetings, they're heard and they need to be taken into consideration. So it does seem like a good idea. But getting more involved, sort of the next question I see in Q&A sort of follows from that. They say, often it seems that candidates are independently wealthy. How can we address the financial barriers that might dissuade younger candidates? Might not be realistic for us to leave high potential or earning careers to run for office, especially if we are first generation or don't have financial security. I know, many of the state Senate seats, for example, are not full-time jobs. But talk to us a little bit about kind of the financing of campaigns.
Well, financing any campaign is really, really critical. As they say, it takes coal to run a train, but it takes gold to run a campaign. And if you are not able to tap into your own resources, then you got to depend on the ability to go out and recruit help to assist you with fundraising. And I would never, ever let not having resources and not having money stop me from doing anything in my campaign, and it never did. I was blessed in that I had some resources, personal resources that I could get involved with, but people aren't going to elect you because you're the most wealthiest person in the race. Otherwise, Bloomberg would be our presidential candidate in the Democratic ticket. That is not the case. It's the person who's going to endear themselves to the public, the person who's going to sell themselves to those who they are seeking to their vote and support. And it really got to be done at the grassroots level. What I mean by the grassroots level, as our other panelists, Amanda's talked about, you can't be afraid, and I want to just remind everybody who's interested in politics, by the way, to humble yourself to the public. And there are some candidates that are very wealthy, that may have far more resources, but they have that inability to humble themselves before the public. And if you are going to make a connection, if you're going to get involved, if you're going to even depend on anyone to give any of their talent, time, and treasure to you, like they did in my church, by the way. And out of my church affiliation came 50 warriors who went out there and fought vigorously for me. And they didn't ask for any kind of compensation for the work that they did. It was a campaign of love. And why did they do that? They did it because they believed that I would then represent their interests better than anyone else. And I had humbled myself before the public and certainly before those who supported me in my campaign early on, and even those that are still with me today. Please don't ever think that you need a whole lot of money or you need vast resources to get involved in the campaign. I was born here in Atlanta, orphaned by the time I was 11 years old. And there wasn't a silver spoon anywhere near, not even just in my home, but anywhere near my table, by the way. And I was one of those persons who went out and fought every single day and believed that I could make a difference and never, ever gave up. And that's the best message I can leave with our students here today. It's not about money. It's about who you are. It's about you humbling yourself to the public. It's about getting those that are around you to believe in the message that you are trying to communicate. And if you do a good job in doing that, you'll be amazed at the people that will follow you.
Amanda, anything to add there?
I think it is so important to distinguish. What the Senator says is absolutely right. You can win a campaign without spending the most money. Most of the candidates Run for Something works with are not the number one spenders or raisers in their race. 75% of school board races cost $1,000 or less. 85% cost $5,000 or less. I was just looking at Texas filing deadlines for state house candidates in Texas. Most of them in the last quarter raised couple $100,000, which is a lot of money, but also for a really competitive state house race, when you're talking like, it is easy to forget that while the presidential campaign is $1 billion endeavor, most of the other 500,000 offices people are running for are not. And there are some real structural barriers to personal finances to running for office. As Gwen really eloquently pointed out, most state legislatures are not full-time positions. They're not paid as much accordingly. In New Hampshire, state legislators are paid like $400 a year. Most city councils are not paid. Most school boards are not paid. And that's a real barrier for people who do not have independent wealth. It is a real barrier to people who maybe do not have jobs that are flexible and allow them to take time. it's a real barrier to young people. It's one of the reasons why Run for Something specifically works with people 18 to 40, because the stage you are in your life is very different than when you are later in your career, have an established network. Maybe your kids have left home and you have a little bit of money built up. So I don't want to pretend that's not a real barrier. It is. And the unfortunate only way to fix it is, one, for the people who can have their finances in order such that they're able to run for office, do so, and then change the structure of these institutions. State legislatures should get paid more. Kind of a hot take. State legislatures should get paid more, because then you will get more diverse people in office, because you don't need to rely on independently wealthy folks to do it. State legislators should get paid more because it will reduce the amount of corruption necessary, or the amount of corruption that is inherent in a situation where you have to take outside funds in order to be able to support your lifestyle. You should also be able to pay your staff more, because you'll get better talent. It is much like the private sector. When you pay more, you often get better people. We should pay our elected officials more. And I want to remind you that if you're thinking about running for office and you're like, I don't have $200,000 of my own money to spend on a campaign, you're not spending your own money. And that, I think, is the final thing that people often lose sight of. Yes, a campaign might spend a couple $100,000, but it is money you're asking of from others who will invest not because they like you necessarily, but because they're investing in their community. I think especially for women, this is something we struggle with in fundraising, of feeling like I can't ask them for money. There's a certain amount of like imposter syndrome and gendered bullshit built into this idea that I should ask someone to invest in me as a person, but you're not. You're asking them to invest in a better future for the community you live in. And when you're able to reframe it like that, the process of fundraising becomes, it's never fun, but it does become at least a little more congruent with the mission of your campaign.
Right. That sort of leads to my next question, which is, what is the ideal candidate? Is there an ideal candidate for running for office? And we also have a lot of international students on the call today. Is there a role for them? You know, they might get permanent resident status soon, or potentially become a citizen later, but will have an accent potentially. Is there a role for sort of an international candidate as well?
Is there a perfect candidate? I've never met one, nor would I would profess to be one, by the way. I think that's a decision that each person has to make individually. You got to look at yourself and see what skills, what attributes, what can you contribute to the greater good. And for me, the experiences I gained, and certainly having gone through business school, having started a business, having experienced the pitfalls of being in business was something that was critical to me, that I was able to communicate effectively to the public, particularly at a time when we were talking about, this is pre-Obamacare, by the way, we were talking about healthcare in America, and then having that experience I had on working for Henry Medical Center and sitting on the executive board and chairing the finance committee, I understood the language. So if anyone ever tells you they're a perfect candidate, I think you should run away from that person because politics tends to change you once you get involved, and you don't know how those changes, what kind of impact those changes are going to have on you. That's why a lot of people don't survive. That's why a lot of people tend to run afoul of the law when they get in politics, because the process and the position has changed them for whatever the reason. My goal has always been to enter politics and leave politics the very same from the very first day that I entered it, and not let this position or whatever position I may run for change me, but for me to change the position. And I would agree that certainly in state legislatures and other elected official positions across the country, the pay would be better. Unfortunately, anytime in Georgia, of course, we're paid $18,000 a year as state senators. We've attempted to raise the pay. Those who carried that legislation never made it back the next term. So the public doesn't look too wisely on paying politicians more and having us enrich ourselves at their expense. They really don't. And that is unfortunate, because there's so many other people that would make themselves available publicly if they had, and they knew that they could continue to take care of themselves, their family, and provide for a way that they were providing for before they even made a decision to get involved in politics. For me, politics is community service. And I don't ever profess to be perfect in any way. I never, ever will be. But as long as I keep my eye on serving the community, then I know I'm be comfortably reelected each time around. And I didn't get a chance to talk about legislation that I've introduced or proposed, but there's one piece of legislation that's near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to talk about how we get ideas on what we propose and some of the issues that we champion. We had a situation here in my community where school kids, particularly school kids of color, was being penalized severely, much more than the entire student body, by the way, and those cases where kids were being routinely expelled from school for minor infractions. We had a zero tolerance law in Georgia, like a lot of other states. So one of the things that I built my career around is changing those zero tolerance laws in the state of Georgia and making sure that we change how kids interact, particularly with law enforcement. Not only did I pass legislation in the Republican administration to change our zero tolerance laws, and I inserted one word, and that word was intent. So kids couldn't be punished as long as there was no intent to do anyone any harm. You'd be amazed what that one word did in the legislature and the language that I introduced. Another bill that I introduced was bringing parity between that hearing officer and that student and that interaction, because hearing officers were always hired by the superintendents and they were loyal to their paycheck. We changed the laws, and I changed the laws so that the state school superintendent had to promulgate rules on how those hearing officers interact with students. And one thing that I'm really, really proud of, and this shows the impact in the community, and this is an idea that came from me from my local community, about how kids in some schools in my district was not handled properly by the school resource officers. Georgia is the first state in the country, legislation that I passed, that require resource officers, school resource officers, to be certified by post. And that's our police officer standards training. We created a unique certification in Georgia. And I said we are creating it because it's taken 2 years, by the way, and it hasn't completed, but it's in the process. We'll be the first state in the country to have a unique certification for school resource officers. And why is that important? That's important because in Georgia and a lot of our school systems, the resource officers came, particularly in Henry County, from the sheriff's department. And these were typically officers that they had taken out of the field for whatever, quote, minor infraction they may have incurred, and they were given assignments over in school. So you got an individual who's already carrying some kind of chip on their shoulder, and they're trying to interact with elementary and middle and even high school students. And those interactions have not been fair to the students in our great state. And this legislation changes that. Not only does it create that unique certification, but we also created some additional training models for our school resource officers. That kind of language and those kind of legislation came out of the community of which I serve and the community of which I represent.
Right, and it seems like social justice, criminal justice, reforming the police, security in our schools, these are increasingly important topics right now in this upcoming local election. It does also feel that kind of the courage of your convictions and talking about things you want to change in society might be a great way to think about running for office. Amanda, are you seeing more and more social justice and criminal justice issues at the forefront of your candidates, or what other topics do you see coming up during this election?
Right now, nearly 100% COVID all the time. And I think that is understandable. And it is a social justice issue. It's a public health crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a crisis of equity. It is a housing crisis imminently, if not already. It's a food security crisis. It is, I think, illuminating all of the parts of the system that were already deeply broken and that people were holding together with gum and Band-Aids. And what the pandemic has done is show us that that is not a way to keep a sustainable system afloat, especially on the more local level with things like keeping schools open, or here in New York, the complete bullshit going on between the mayor and the governor and the inability to determine who's in charge, let alone what they want to do with that power. Public transit and the safety or lack thereof of getting around a community. It has been what we hear overwhelmingly from our candidates, and what they're talking to voters about is the pandemic. and different ways that has illuminated the problems with our broken system. Criminal justice reform, racial justice, police funding, that's all a component of it. But the number one thing is the pandemic. And I will say the other piece here is and this is where the service comes in. It is not just like, wow, this is terrible, but I'm having problems getting free lunch for my kids because, for example, in Virginia, when the pandemic first started in maybe April, the USDA had a rule that if you needed to pick up free lunch from the program that they were running for a kid, the kid had to be present. And for a lot of parents, that wasn't an option for any number of reasons, not the least of which is what if your kid is sick or immunocompromised or quarantining or could have come in contact with someone. So one of the state house members in Virginia, Delegate Danica Rome, fought the USDA and ultimately got them to issue a waiver that said the kid did not have to be present to pick up the free meal, which made it so 1 million more children could get access to the lunches that they needed, and the families could afford the food or could get the food for free. It's the kind of thing where a lot of our candidates are simply helping people navigate and figure out survival, which is devastating, but also shows the impact of having someone who's really close and in touch with the community being able to fight for them.
And I wonder if there's also a role for business school students and graduates who can, help volunteer or run for office or serve in government to help with the systems and operations and efficiency that are so important, particularly, in a crisis time like right now. Senator Jones, speaking from that sort of business angle, how do you work with business or business leaders, someone's asking, for the state of Georgia to stay relevant in the U.S. economy, or what is the role for business to help in government, or should they lobby, should they not? What have you seen in terms of the interaction between policy and business?
But certainly, I would agree that all of the above, right? Businesses have a platform, and let me just add that as part of the Biden-Harris campaign and being a surrogate, I've hosted a small business roundtable, and it's interesting to hear the conversation about the concerns of minority-owned small businesses and majority-owned small businesses in dealing with places like when it comes to PPE and EIDL, the Economic Impact Disaster Loans, and the payment protection programs as well. And all those kind of things that's under ISBA. Those are kind of issues that business people know and have a keen interest in, which gives us that leverage in being able to lobby and speak to those issues, particularly at a legislative level. The need, particularly in the community today, we see more of our businesses that are closing, that are failing because of the pandemic and because of the environment that we're in today. 90% of minority-owned businesses, I believe Black-owned businesses, let me say, I think the exact number may have been about 84% were not in a position to take advantage of the PPP program for whatever reason. And these are all cases where the federal government should have a role in defining what the program is going to be. The federal government should have a role in defining how funds are going to be distributed equitably in all of our communities. And those are the issues that we as African-American legislators, and not just African-American legislators, but any legislator should raise, because if you don't, then you're going to continue to get the kind of unbalanced calamity that we see with this pandemic in our communities. And communities of color have been hit much harder. And that's the message that we're trying to communicate to the Biden-Harris, which is why he's come out with his initiative and building back better programs and some of the platforms that we've all been instrumental in having input on, that he's put out on his website. We have to fundamentally change the course of direction in this country if we expect minority-owned businesses to survive. Personally, my business was able to take advantage of the PPP program, and being in retail and looking back on that time back in the mid-March when we were excused out of the legislature and told to go back to our businesses. We are part-time legislators in the state of Georgia. and I'm looking at, $8 million worth of inventory on the lot and wondering if that inventory is ever going to move again, and having a payroll of about 90 people that I have employed at my store and wondering, okay, what's going to happen next? That uncertainty is something that's critical to any business person in trying to anticipate what's going to happen. As they'll say, those things that you learn back in business school, some things that you really just can't plan for, because this was kind of an incident. The pandemic came on so quickly, and we were ill prepared at the national level, which filtered down to all the rest of us. And of course, we were ill prepared to deal with it as well. But we did. And several of my other business leaders and partners that I know, we all had an opportunity to share resources. We started networking with each other, and we started buying from each other and moving resources around. And thank God that throughout this pandemic, some of our businesses, and mine is in that category as well, has come out much stronger than it was prior to the pandemic. So those are all things that we have to do, and we never ever can take our sight off of what's important in our communities.
Amanda, anything to add about the role of business and politics? No? Okay, we'll just do time for one or two more questions. So please do add them to the Q&A if anyone has any. But I think maybe one we could end on, if there are no more, is the question in the Q&A. This is a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for having it. Senator Jones and Amanda, I would love to know your thoughts on how we can engage with politics, elections, issues, engagement. I'm assuming she means discussion, while at Columbia Business School, when it's so incredibly polarizing these days, and we want to keep an inclusive space for everyone. Any last thoughts on, how to engage, considering how polarized we are, but then also how folks can potentially get more involved with both of you, either your campaigns or your organization, if you could just let everybody know.
Well, I know one thing that I would like to see business students do to get engaged is to remember that there are phones that we do have. We've gotten away from that old-fashioned way of communicating with people. And in an era of pandemic where you aren't able to physically be in contact with large crowds, and that's one thing that we as politicians thrive on, by the way, that interaction, particularly with crowds and groups of people. One thing that we've done down here in my local community is that we started calling each other. And out of those phone calls, we started connecting those that we were calling, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers. I'm even engaging some of my employees. We started putting together little small chat rooms, and out of those chat rooms came small Zoom meetings and groups. So we are able to talk about issues effectively using these platforms that we have today. But when you're in school, I know it's very difficult with studies. I know it's very difficult being in a large metropolitan area. The issues that interact with people in a large metropolitan area is not much different than in a smaller area, so we have to drive further. And for me, I remember the time when I was at Columbia, I had an assignment to go out and create a, quote, entrepreneur project. And it gave me an opportunity to go out and talk to people in the community, talk to small business owners, interact with some of those other residents in the building that I lived in. And any way that you can talk to people, any way that you can interact with people at whatever level is going to be critical in building relationships. And to me, it's those relationships that are important. It's those relationships that I found most impactful, because we don't know everything about everything there is to know. But if you know someone that does, then they become a resource to you. And I can't emphasize enough the ability to go out and have a one-on-one conversation with someone. And that could be a dry cleaner, as an example. I'm really good friends with my dry cleaner in my local community. As a matter of fact, my dry cleaner's son works in my dealership. It's those kind of relationships, those kind of meetings that we have in our circle of influence. Dry cleaners, where you go to your barber and you get your hair styled, you get it cut, and your local deli or grocery store where you shop and you meet someone who's there checking you out at the counter. You can have those kind of conversations. And I call it communicating up and down the chain. And that's one thing that we do well as politicians. And that's one thing that I hope that as long as I'm in the political arena, that I never, ever stop doing. And it's not about having a CBS MBA. And I always believe, like Winston Churchill, that knowledge is like a pocket watch, that you really don't need to pull it out unless you need to school somebody and really tell them what time it is. And I've had to do that on occasion. But that's just the kind of, I think, the kind of attitude you got to have when you're interacting in the community, when you're interacting with people that you may not know or you may meet for the first time. As we say in politics, you got to meet them, date them, and marry them, and then divorce them all in the same conversation. But it's those kind of things that make for meaningful political relationships and meaningful relationships in life as well. And those people will stick by you. They will stay with you. Even though you divorced them during that time, they'll still come back again and remarry you. And those are the kind of things that people will continue to support you as you continue to plan out what you want to do with your life politically and as well as in the business community.
Thank you very much. Amanda, any last words on how to get involved, maybe with your organization or in general?
I want to make sure that any person listening to this today, and maybe this is preaching to the choir, but you have a responsibility to be involved in the political process. It is the height of privilege to absolve yourself of that responsibility, because politics affects the people who do it. You have a responsibility. Like, as a Columbia Business School student or graduate, you are going to be a leader in the business community. You have the potential to be a high earning member of the business community. You have a responsibility to be part of this process and to do so in a way that is in line with your values. And it might be hard, and it might be scary, and it might involve hard conversations with people who don't agree with you. That's fine. You should do it anyway. And I understand the need to make, to feel pressure to like make it inclusive or comfortable, but you should aim to be uncomfortable sometimes as part of the political process, because ultimately that's what makes democratic engagement, and I mean democratic in the lowercase d, more people engaging in our democracy stronger. That being said, if you want to get involved with Run for Something, you should go to our website, runforsomething.net. You can sign up to volunteer. We're always looking for more people to help us screen candidates. If you're interested in running for office, you should also go to our website. In particular, if you go to runforwhat.net, that's the tool specifically that will allow you to enter your address and see the offices available to you to run for in 2021 and 2022 as we get data for that as well. You will then get an invite to a conference call. Join that. That's the next step. If you're looking for campaigns to volunteer right now, again, our website is the place to go. We have a full map. You can search wherever in the country or wherever you want to be in the country and find a local campaign that needs your help. The doors, well, not doors you knock on, the voters you call, the voters you text, the people you write postcards to, regardless of what campaign you're actually doing them for, whether it's a state legislature, city council, school board, library board, what have you, all of it counts as voter contact in service of the larger goal of getting people engaged in our democracy. And there are people who won't complete the whole ballot unless they've heard from someone from a local campaign. So by doing so for a state legislative race, you're also helping elect the presidential candidate of your choice, because a voter touched is a voter touched. In the campaign sense of a voter contacted is a voter contacted. So I hope you'll sign up to volunteer, whether with us or with one of our candidates. They are phenomenal. They also are real people who have experiences just like you, and it's really, I find it really fun to campaign and to work on behalf of candidates who I feel like could be my friend. It makes it, I feel, more personal. So.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I found this to be a very inspiring discussion. So really appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to the next time. Thanks a lot, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.